When I was a kid, every now and again my grandma would come over and pick up Blake and I and take us to the drive-thru to get Happy Meals at every kid's favorite restaurant, the finest of classiest of dining establishments. And we would always take it to go, and we'd head up to Highland Park. And we'd get to eat our food, and we'd get to go play on the jungle gyms and all that stuff. But my absolute favorite part about these expeditions with my grandmother was always what we did after we were kind of done playing. Every time we went, Grandma would bring a loaf of bread with her, and we would go down to the little creek that runs through Highland Park, and we'd feed the ducks or the geese, or once or twice actually a swan that happened to be there floating around. I love doing that part. It was always my favorite thing to be able to throw bread at a duck and hopefully get it to try to chase my brother. But to see them, to be near that kind of animal and that sort of thing was always kind of cool. But I always used to love throwing it while they were swimming on the water and to watch them glide so effortlessly across it and be able to snatch up that piece of bread without any sort of effort whatsoever and without breaking their stride. Even now, to this day, I find myself easily transfixed by watching those types of animals as they're swimming on the water. To this day, every time we pass by a group of geese or ducks or whatever, I'll point it out to the girls who aren't nearly as enthusiastic as I am about it. I think once or twice I've gotten them to actually look up from their iPads enough to actually see a goose. But I always find it so cool. Like, there's just nothing in the world that's quite as relaxing to me as being able to just sit in a quiet area and just watch as ducks and geese and, again, swans just kind of glide on the water. There's something about it that's just so incredible to me. But recently, my viewpoint of these particular creatures has been shifted. See, because a duck or a swan or anything like that, it slides on the water so effortlessly, so gracefully. But I learned something recently that kind of shook my viewpoint of this. And I'm going to share it with you, and I hope it doesn't destroy your worldview as it did mine. But as effortlessly as ducks and geese and swans look while they're gliding upon the water, as calm and as serene as everything looks in that moment, just below the surface, they're paddling, they're kicking, they're stirring up the water like crazy. It is anything but calm and serene just below that surface. In fact, it would probably be attributed as nothing but chaos taking place underneath there as they squirm and kick and paddle and do everything possible to try to keep themselves above water. Now, to be honest, I don't know why this particular thing shook my viewpoint so much on these particular animals. It kind of makes sense if you think about it. Ducks, geese, swans, they all breathe air like us. And unless you're some type of marine animal, you're going to have to struggle to be able to get oxygen if you're in the water, right? We call it swimming. There's two types of swimming. There's the swimmers who make it look easy, and the other ones who look like they're drowning at all times, right? And if you throw any other kind of animal into the water that's not, again, some type of marine life or whatever, they're going to look like they're struggling, aren't they? You ever seen a dog actually in the water? I watched a video just the other day of a family saying, we got to remove our pool because they had two dogs, and one of them jumped in the water and could not get himself back up. And so one of the owners had to jump in and save the dog. And as they were pulling the other dog out of the water, the other dog jumped into the water. And no sooner had they gotten to that one than the first dog jumped back in, because dogs are awesome. But any other animal that you put in the water is going to kick and struggle and paddle. You're going to see the struggle that's taking place for them to stay above water. It's going to become a lot more evident to you, to the point that you wonder, what are you doing there in the first place? How did you get into this mess? We don't say that about ducks or geese or swans, because they've gotten really, really adept at hiding the struggle that is taking place just below the surface. They've gotten so good at it, in fact, that we don't view it as a struggle at all. That they're just able to calmly and serenely move without a care in the world, without giving it any sort of effort whatsoever. They've gotten really good at hiding the chaos that's taking place to keep them afloat. We could probably say the same about a lot of us, though, couldn't we? See, every single one of us in this room, we know for a fact that life, no matter where you come from, no matter what economic standing you're in, no matter what your background is, life will be a constant series of struggles. That wave after wave will continue to hit after us, that it's only those moments where the struggle is a little lighter that we get to appreciate what life truly is. Every single one of us faces dark times. We face times in our lives where decisions are made that are beyond our control and we don't know how to process them, where we made decisions that were very much in our control and ended up being the wrong decision. When people that we care about get sick, when the people that we rely on pass away. No matter where you come from, no matter how much money you got in the bank account, there will always be a struggle in life. But some of us have gotten really good about hiding that struggle, haven't we? We see people who it seems like life is easy for them. That they're just gliding upon the water of life with no problems whatsoever. They've gotten really good at hiding the fact that just below the surface, a struggle is taking place that we can't see. That something is going on, something that is they're having to struggle to keep their head above the proverbial water. And there's a part of us that I don't understand. Because again, each and every one of us knows that every person that we encounter struggles, and that some people are just really good at hiding it. But there's a part of us that when we see someone whose struggle is a little more evident, that they're not able to hide the struggle that's taking place below the surface, but in fact it's visible for all to see, there's a part of us that looks down on those types of people. That when we encounter them, we find ourselves wondering, how did you get to this point? We make assumptions about them. We have a tendency to judge them. We see the thing that's going on, we see the struggle it's not being hidden whatsoever, and our natural viewpoint is to make assumptions about that person. We do so based solely on their inability to hide the same struggles that we are going through. We look down on them. We never say it, but there's always that little part of us. I hate that I have to include myself in this as well. We think we're better than them. All because they're not doing as good a job as we are at hiding the struggle. We've gotten adept to being able to hide that struggle, to make it look graceful and effortless. And unfortunately, at least in this point in time in their life, they're not. So we make our assumptions. We already assume we know what kind of life they lead. We know what kind of decisions that they've made to lead them to this point. In fact, we even are so full of ourselves that we know exactly what steps they need to take to get out of it. Don't we? If there's one place in the world, if there's one spot where we should be able to completely let go of that mindset, where we should be able to let our guard down, to show everyone exactly how much struggle that's going on, to be open and honest and transparent about the struggle that we've done a really good job of hiding just below the surface. If there's one spot that we should be able to do that, it should be the church. Right? You've heard me over and over again refer to ourselves as brothers and sisters in Christ. We should be able to come to this place and feel open and honest and able to say, here's where I'm struggling with right now. And in fact, here's what I'm struggling with. Or at the very least, it should be the kind of place where those who struggle is more evident. Those who struggle is not being hidden so well behind the surface can come and feel warm and welcome and like people actually care about their struggle. That should be the case. But far too often it is not. In fact, for most people, the church has become the place where they got to hide that struggle even better. Where they got to be more skilled at gliding across the proverbial waters of life, where they got to do even more to try to hide the chaos that's taking place below the surface. The church has not been a place for them where they can feel open and honest about their struggle. It's the place where they got to make sure that it is reinforced that they're hiding it. Oftentimes this is learned behavior. See, for most of us, we've seen people who have been open and honest and transparent in the church, and instead of being warm and received and their burdens being lifted up, Instead, we've seen them being cast aside. We've seen people give them side glances. We've heard judgmental comments taking place. We've heard them become the subject of hurtful and hateful gossip. It doesn't make their struggle easier. It makes it so much more painful to bear. A place that should be a place of refuge is far too often a place of more judgment. But have no mistake, judgmentalism has been around since there were people. In fact, I'm firmly convinced that maybe when Eve first looked at Adam, she was already making her assumptions about him. Once there were more than one people on the earth, there was judgmentalism. And this has been a case all over the place. In fact, it's something that took place even amongst Jesus' time. And maybe more surprisingly, judgmentalism even took place amongst Jesus' closest followers. In fact, that's going to be the theme of what we're going to see in our text today. We're going to be in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. So if you got your Bible or your Bible app on your phone, open it up to John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. As you're doing that, let me give you a little bit of background, give you an idea of where we are when we get to this particular point. This part in John chapter 9 is where things are beginning to shift for Jesus. Up to this particular point, Jesus has gotten a lot of notoriety as a healer, as a teacher, as somebody you want to be around, somebody who cares about those who are on the fringes, who are outside. He's gathering large crowds of people nearly everywhere that he goes. But the mindset of the Pharisees that's taking place here, they're beginning to have a shift in their opinion of Jesus. Their mindset is going from this Jesus guy may be somebody we need to be worried about to this Jesus guy is somebody we need to get rid of. They're becoming a lot more bold in how they attack Jesus. They're becoming a lot more clever in the ways that they try to trap him in what they say and what he says. Jesus' disciples have seen Jesus do all kinds of other things. They've heard all kinds of unusual teachings from Jesus, and a lot very recently. They've already heard Jesus say phrases like, "I am the bread of life." That just took place in John chapter 6, verse 35. They've heard him say, "I am the light of the world." Jesus has kind of shifted from teachings about parables about the kingdom of God to now shifting and saying who he is and what his role in all of this is. The disciples have seen Jesus do incredible things in the short amount of time that they've been with him. They have seen him feed 5,000. In fact, I'm willing to bet, we always forget about this particular part of that particular narrative. When Jesus fed the 5,000, they went and got basketfuls of leftovers. There were 12 basketfuls. Who ate those leftovers? I'm going to guess the disciples had a couple of meals after the fact. They've seen Jesus heal the sick. They've seen him help paralytics rise. It's very likely, even at this point, they have seen Jesus raise the dead. And they've certainly seen Jesus bring sight to the blind. But when we get to John chapter 9, we're introduced to a blind man who's got a unique perspective. In fact, John chapter 9, verse 1 says something about this particular blind man that we've not heard in any of the other narratives of Jesus encountering blind folks. Here's what it says, verse 1. It says, as he was passing by, he saw a man blind, and here's where it comes different, from birth. Jesus has encountered blind folks beforehand. There's about 6 different narratives of Jesus encountering those who are blind. And this is the only one that points out that this particular guy has been blind from the moment he was born. I bring that up because we're about to see in verse 2 that there's a huge amount of contextual stuff that's going on. And the reason why John brings up the fact that he's blind from birth is actually going to be really important here in just a second. As they're coming there, Jesus' disciples, they ask him something that if we don't understand the context of it, if we don't understand what's going on culturally here, the question the disciples ask Jesus makes the disciples sound like a whole bunch of jerks. Right? The disciples were never jerks, were they? They never said anything dumb. Right? Hello? Do we need to talk about Peter again? My favorite bonehead? But here's what they say in verse 2. It says, his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents, that he be born blind. Wow. That's a bold question, isn't it? They come across this guy who apparently is so well known in this community that everybody knows he was born blind, that he's never been able to see anything in his entire life. And this is what they ask him. They don't ask Jesus, why is he blind? They don't ask Jesus, is there anything that we could do for this guy? They say, who sinned? Him or his parents? That this would happen. There was a really popular school of thought at this particular notion, in this particular time period especially. It was kind of the latest rage in theological thought. It was something that a lot of people tended to believe, and that was that if people were born with any sort of physical deformity or any sort of disability, then the only reason that that could have possibly happened is because their parents had some sort of a sin that they had not atoned for, or that somehow during their development within the womb, this one makes no sense to me, that they sinned before they ever could have a coherent thought. Before they ever had an opportunity to do anything, they did something to upset God, and so God struck them. How did this get popular? The reality is that we can kind of understand how this particular school of thought got popular because it's still somewhat popular today. In Buddhism and Hinduism, they teach a idea called karma. That whatever you do has actions. If you do good stuff will happen to you. If you do bad stuff, well, bad stuff's going to happen to you. I don't know about you, but I've done good stuff and bad stuff still happened. And I've seen people do bad stuff, and good stuff still happens to them. It's a flawed theology. But here's the thing. Something I want to point out to you. The disciples had no idea who this guy was. They'd never met him before. They'd never encountered him before. They had never seen this man before. And yet when they first see him, when they first encounter him, and they notice that he's blind, and they have heard from other people that he was born that way, they made assumptions. They cast their judgment already. And it's very likely for this guy in this particular time period that this has been going on his entire life. At the minute his entire community found out that this kid could not see, this community knew something was up. That his parents must be just terrible people who are hiding things behind the scenes. That they must have done some sort of evil and heinous sin that God should feel the need to do this. Or at the very least, maybe they thought, well, maybe this guy would just be evil if he was able to see. That he would turn into the world's first supervillain if he were able to see. They cast their judgment on him without ever getting to know him. Without ever getting to know his family, without ever getting to see what's really going on behind the scenes, to maybe find out that his parents were actually great folks, that this sort of thing just happened. That unfortunately their son was just born blind. Now, we understand that nowadays because our medical science has gotten a little bit further along from what it was. We do radical and revolutionary things that they weren't doing at this point in time, like washing our hands. There's a myriad of different reasons why this guy could have been born blind, but for everybody who encountered him in his entire life up to this particular point, they'd already made their assumption of what happened. They believed that his family, that he himself, or that his parents had to be horrible sinners for God to be able to do this sort of thing. And now even the disciples of Jesus himself are saying the same things that he's heard his entire life. But that's not the way that Jesus looks at this guy. I mean, we probably ought to expect that, right? It is Jesus that we're talking about. Now, Jesus looks at this dude in a whole other light. Jesus has a completely different approach altogether for why this particular guy is wrestling with his blindness. He says in verse 3, he says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. This came about so that God's works might be displayed in him." Jesus does not look at this guy who was born blind and jump to the conclusion that he or his parents have some deep, dark secret. He doesn't rush to the conclusion that this guy is somehow less than. That because the struggle that he has to deal with in his life is evident for all to see, that he is somehow less than everyone else around him. Jesus sees this man who has struggled with this particular affliction his entire life, whose struggle in the proverbial waters of life has been evident to all since the day he was born. And he sees an opportunity. In fact, I don't normally do this. Whenever I go through a particular text, I'll oftentimes consult what are called biblical commentaries and stuff. And there was one particular line that a commentator gave that I loved. So much so that I'm going to give you word for word. This is from, let me get this guy's name right. Where am I at here? Merrill Tenney. He talks about Jesus' response here. He says, Jesus refused to accept either alternative suggested by the disciples' question. He looked on the man's plight not as retribution for some offense committed by either his parents or by himself, but as an opportunity for God's work. Jesus did not consider the blindness as punishment or as a matter of irrational choice. It was a challenge to manifest God's healing power in this man's life. When Jesus saw this guy who was born blind, he did not race to the conclusion that somebody sinned. He did not jump into the idea that this guy has made nothing but poor choices in his life, or that his parents made horrible decision-making, that God feels the need to make this happen. Instead, Jesus looked at this guy and he saw an opportunity for ministry. He saw a chance to show this guy the love of God in the most tangible way possible. Everyone around him could see the struggle that his life was. We've talked about this before, but if you had any sort of physical deformity that would prevent you from being able to work, and this is a very manual labor-heavy economy that we're in, so blindness is going to make it hard to work, you were completely dependent on somebody else. Either your family had to take care of you your entire life, or you had to go beg, asking money or food from strangers. And that's how you survive. This guy's entire life has been a struggle, but while every other person that he's ever encountered saw his plight and rushed to judgment of him, Jesus instead saw an opportunity for ministry. And after Jesus says this, he kind of does the stuff that we normally expect Jesus to do. He does it a little weird, if I'm honest with you. Like the rest of this narrative is a little bit different from what I expect from Jesus. We see it in verses 6 and 7. He says, after he said these things, he spit on the ground. Weird. Made mud from the saliva. Okay, you could do that. That's a choice. And then spread the mud on his eyes. That's unsanitary. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And so he left, washed, and came back seeing. Sure, this is a little different from what we might expect. I mean, we've seen Jesus in other times just like place his hand on somebody and say, see, and they can see. Jesus went a little different way this time. That's okay. But after his only encounter with Jesus, this guy was able to see for the first time. Can you imagine that? It's likely that a lot of you this weekend, you had to deal with some power outage, right? Maybe you were asleep through the whole thing. I wasn't. I was almost there, but a lot of you had to deal with power outage. Remember just that sigh of relief that happens when the power comes back on? Imagine that, but you've spent your entire life in darkness. And finally, after years of struggling, after years of constantly having to beg, after years of facing judgment, of hearing the whispers that are going on behind your back, of hearing what people are saying about your mom and your dad, for the first time ever, he's able to open his eyes and to see. Because one person didn't rush to judgment of him, but instead saw an opportunity for ministry. Yeah, okay. Even though it has absolutely nothing to do with anything I've talked about thus far, or anything I'm going to talk about from this point on, I love how this particular narrative ends. I love the way that John ends it. Because after he has this encounter, and people are able to recognize this guy who now is all of a sudden able to see, they're able to recognize him as the guy who was blind and begging for money his entire life. They all start asking him, wait, how did this happen? And he just can only answer, well, some dude named Jesus made it happen. And then they ask him, in verse 12, it says, where is he? They asked. I don't know, he said. They asked a guy who was blind where somebody went. That's funny. I think if it had been me, I would have probably said, I didn't see where he went. Before he met Jesus, this dude's entire life was a struggle. And it was a struggle that every person he encountered was able to see. It was painstakingly evident for everyone around him to be able to see that he was struggling to keep his head above that proverbial water. And because he was born blind at a time period where that specific thing had theology based around it, that there were biblical scholars who were telling everyone if you see someone with physical deformities, it's because them or their parents have sinned against God. So every person he ever encountered his entire life judged him without getting to know him, without getting to know his parents. They rushed to make assumptions. They rushed to their judgment. Their mind was made up about who this guy was. Judgment was pronounced, and even the disciples of Jesus had made their assumptions about him. While we still may not do this sort of thing when it comes to physical limitations, we still do this in 100 other areas of life. When we see someone whose person's house is a little run down, when they're facing disrepair, when we see the person who just looks a little dirty or maybe has a weird smell to them, when we see the person on the side of the street holding up a sign, every single one of us in this room, unfortunately myself included, have made judgments about those people. We've made our assumptions about what their life is like or what decisions they've made or what choices have led them to this point. But let me ask you, you ever actually talked to them? Have you ever had a conversation with them? Have you tried to get to know them even a little bit before making your assumptions about them and their life? I can promise you, there's more to the story. There's more to the story of why their particular struggle is so evident to you right now, of why they're not able to keep the struggle below the surface like you are. Because make no mistake, every single one of us struggles throughout our lives. We struggle from the day we're born until the day they put us in the ground. It is a fact of life. If you came here for the warm fuzzies, I'm sorry you picked the wrong Sunday. Every single one of us in this room knows what it means and knows what it is like to struggle. We've just become really good ducks. We've been able to keep it below the surface to where nobody can see it. And when we see somebody whose struggle is more evident, we rush to judgment of them. We make assumptions about them. We make our decisions about who they must be without ever getting to know more about it. We need to shift our mindset. Instead of seeing people in the midst of their struggle and making assumptions about them, what if instead we saw them as an opportunity to show the love of God? What if instead of trying to figure out who sinned, instead we thought, how can I help? How can I help them in the midst of this struggle? What does it look like for me to throw them a life preserver? What can I do to help alleviate this sort of thing? And at the very least, folks, at the very least, when they're here, when anyone walks through those doors, the only thing that they should encounter is the love of Jesus Christ. That is, understand me, the bare minimum that we can give them. Instead, I think we ought to ask ourselves, how can I help? To stop asking who sinned, to stop asking what led them to this point, to stop making assumptions about who they must be, and instead get to know them so that we can know how to best minister to them, how we can show them the love of Jesus. When Jesus encountered this guy born blind, who'd been dealing with this kind of judgment and assumptions his entire life, in one encounter with the only person to not race to assumptions from him, his whole life has changed. What if we took the same approach? What if we decided to show them love, to view them not as a hindrance or not as something that is less than us, but to view them as an opportunity? Understand, folks, judgmentalism will destroy unity. It will destroy it. But when we make a choice to love, love will bind us together. Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, verse 37, and we're going to close with it today. He said, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven."
bensound.com